The haystack incident. Tom Grayson had lived on his farm for nearly 40 years, long enough to see just about every oddity rural life could throw at him. He'd wrestled runaway calves back into their pens, pulled tractors out of mud pits, and once even chased off a bear that had wandered too close to the chicken coop. But on that crisp March morning in 2025, as the golden sun spilled over the rolling hills of his property, Tom encountered something entirely new, something that didn't belong in his world of dirt, sweat, and honest work. He'd trudged out to the hay shed at dawn, his boots crunching against the gravel path, expecting nothing more than the usual. The sharp scent of alfalfa, the faint rustle of mice in the rafters, and the comforting bulk of his old John Deere tractor parked where it always was. Instead, his eyes landed on a gleaming white Mercedes-Benz sedan, sitting smugly in the center of the barn like it owned the place. The tractor was nowhere to be seen, shoved unceremoniously to the side, no doubt, and standing beside the car was a woman who looked like she'd just stepped out of a glossy magazine. She was tall and thin, with a sharp blonde bob that framed her face like a helmet. Oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, and a designer handbag hung from her shoulder, its leather so pristine it practically glowed. She was inspecting her manicured nails with an air of boredom, tapping away at her phone, completely oblivious to the fact that she was trespassing on someone else's land. Tom stopped dead in his tracks, his weathered hands curling into fists at his sides. For a moment, he wondered if he'd finally lost it. Maybe the long nights of calving season had driven him to hallucinations. But no, the car was real, and so was the woman. He cleared his throat, the sound loud enough to send a flock of sparrows fluttering from the barn's rafters. The woman barely glanced up, her lips pursing as if he'd interrupted something important. "Morning," Tom said, keeping his voice steady despite the irritation bubbling in his chest. "Something I can help you with?" She let out a sigh so dramatic it could have won an Oscar, lowering her phone just enough to give him a once-over. Her eyes flicked from his dusty jeans to his scuffed work boots, and her lips twitched in what might have been disapproval. "Oh, you must be the farmer," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I was just looking for a spot to park for a bit." Tom blinked, processing her words. "You parked in my hay shed." She nodded, completely unfazed. "Yeah, all the other spots were taken." She waved a hand toward the wide, empty pasture stretching out beside the barn, as if it explained everything. Tom followed her gaze, then looked back at her, his brow furrowing. "Ma'am, there's an entire open field right there." She sighed again, this time with a hint of exasperation, fanning herself with her free hand. "Right, but I needed some shade. Do you have any idea how hot it gets in a car without air conditioning?" She paused, as if expecting him to nod in sympathy. "Besides, I won't be long." Tom folded his arms across his chest, the leather of his jacket creaking. He'd dealt with stubborn mules, unpredictable storms, and even the occasional equipment breakdown, but nothing in his decades of farming had prepared him for this. "This ain't a parking lot," he said, jerking a thumb toward the barn. "I need this space to work." She scoffed, a sharp little sound that grated on his nerves. "I'll only be a few hours. You can work around it." He took a slow, deliberate breath, willing himself to stay calm. "Lady, you're on my property. You can't just—" She held up a finger, cutting him off mid-sentence. "I'm on an important call," she said, turning her back to him and pressing the phone to her ear. "No, Brenda, I told you I need the organic soy latte, not that processed garbage. Just fix it." She let out another exaggerated sigh, then continued. "Anyway, I'm at some farm or whatever, just waiting until my lunch reservation." Tom's left eye twitched. This woman had interrupted him, on his own land, to take a phone call. He stood there, dumbfounded, as she chattered away, oblivious to the absurdity of the situation. His jaw clenched so tight he half expected his teeth to crack. He could have argued with her, could have raised his voice, could have called the sheriff right then and there to have her towed off his property. But something in his gut told him none of that would work. She wasn't the type to listen to reason. No, she needed something else, something bigger, something she'd never forget. His gaze drifted to the towering stacks of hay bales just outside the barn, neatly lined up from yesterday's work. A slow, mischievous grin spread across his face. If she wanted to leave her car here so badly, well, maybe he'd make sure it stayed put. Whistling a tuneless melody, Tom turned on his heel and strolled toward the barn entrance. He spotted his farm hands, Jake and Riley, lounging by the water cooler near the displaced tractor, their faces streaked with sweat from the morning's chores. "Boys," Tom said, rubbing his hands together, "I've got a job for you." It didn't take long for the plan to come together. Jake and Riley exchanged a quick glance, their curiosity piqued, but they didn't ask questions. They'd worked for Tom long enough to know that when he got that glint in his eye, something entertaining was about to happen. "Grab the truck," Tom said, nodding toward the old Ford parked near the shed. "We're going to move some hay." The first few bales were placed almost politely, set down gently around the edges of the Mercedes. Tom stood back, arms crossed, watching as the woman, still yapping on her phone, remained blissfully unaware. "So I told him, if you're not flying first class, then why even fly at all?" she was saying, laughing at her own joke as if it were the cleverest thing ever uttered. Jake hefted a bale onto the growing pile, grinning. "She ain't gonna like this." "She'll notice eventually," Tom replied, his tone dry. "Keep going." The boys picked up the pace. Soon, bales were dropping left and right, stacking higher and higher around the car. Riley climbed into the truck bed to toss them over the top, his lanky frame balancing precariously as he worked. By the time they hit 30 bales, the sedan was half buried, its sleek white body disappearing under a golden wall of hay. And still, the woman didn't look up. Tom leaned against a post, watching as the final bales were maneuvered into place. 50 bales in total, a small mountain of tightly packed hay, now engulfed the car completely. Only the tip of the antenna poked out, a tiny flag of defeat in an otherwise victorious sea of straw. And then, finally, she turned. What have you done to my car?" Her scream was so shrill it sent a fresh batch of birds scattering from the rafters. Tom bit the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing as she spun toward him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Move it right now." Tom scratched his chin, feigning thoughtfulness. "I don't know, seems pretty stuck to me." Her hands clenched into fists, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. "This is illegal. You can't just bury my car." He raised a brow. "Oh, and what do you call parking on someone else's property without permission?" That's different," she spluttered, her face turning an alarming shade of pink. "Do you even know who I am? I have connections. I'll call the mayor." "Go ahead," Tom said, his tone calm but edged with amusement. She yanked out her phone and dialed furiously, her fingers trembling. After a few seconds, her face twisted in confusion. "What do you mean he's busy?" She hung up with a huff, nostrils flaring. "Fine. I'll call the police." Tom shrugged. "You do that." She stormed a few feet away, jabbing at her phone as she dialed 911. Jake and Riley exchanged looks, barely holding back their laughter, while Tom stood there, unbothered, watching the scene unfold. "Yes, I'd like to report a crime," she barked into the phone. "This horrible man has committed agricultural vandalism or something. I don't know. Just send someone now." She hung up with a triumphant huff and turned back to Tom. "You're going to regret this." He smiled, slow and easy. "We'll see." 15 minutes later, a familiar truck rumbled into the driveway, kicking up dust as it rolled to a stop. Sheriff Hank Carter stepped out, pushing his sunglasses up his nose as he surveyed the scene. His eyes flicked from Tom to the massive hay pile, then to the woman, who was now pacing back and forth, her arms flailing like a windmill in a storm. "What's going on here?" Hank asked, his voice heavy with the exhaustion of a man who'd seen too many petty disputes in his time. The woman stormed forward, practically shoving her phone in his face. "Thank God you're here. This man," she jabbed a finger at Tom, "has trapped my car. Arrest him." Hank scratched his head, peering at the hay-covered sedan. "You mean the car that's parked inside his barn? On his property?" "Yes," she cried, her voice rising to a pitch that made Tom wince. Hank sighed, rubbing his temples. "Did you even ask before parking here?" She flailed her arms, her sunglasses slipping down her nose. "I didn't think I had to. It's a barn." Tom leaned toward Hank, his tone deadpan. "I just thought I'd help make sure her car was nice and cozy." Jake let out a snort, quickly covering it with a cough. Hank exhaled slowly, then turned back to the woman. "Lady, you better hope I don't fine you for trespassing." Her jaw dropped. What? She screamed then, a high-pitched wail that echoed across the farm, sending more birds scattering. Tom had expected some outrage, maybe a tantrum, but this was a performance worthy of a theater stage. She stomped her designer heel into the dirt, her arms swinging wildly. You absolute. You backwoods. You. I can't believe this, she screeched, pointing a trembling finger at the hay pile. Do you have any idea who I am? Tom studied her with the same indifference he'd give a fly buzzing around his porch. Still haven't figured that part out, he said. But I do know you parked on my land, refused to move when I asked nicely, and now you're throwing a fit bigger than my cows when they miss breakfast. Her mouth flapped open and shut, her brain clearly struggling to process the fact that he wasn't caving to her demands. For a moment, she seemed lost, but then her face twisted into a sneer. You will remove that hay right now. Tom rocked back on his heels, pretending to consider it. You know, I'd love to, but my back's been acting up lately. Maybe if I had a reason. Her eyes nearly bulged out of her head. A reason? My car is buried under a pile of farm trash. You want a reason? How about I sue you for destruction of property? Go right ahead, Tom said with a shrug. But since this is private property and you parked here without permission, you might just end up paying me for damages. She let out a strangled noise, somewhere between a gasp and a growl. Then her face lit up with sudden realization. Fine. You leave me no choice. She whipped out her phone again, fingers flying across the screen. I'm calling the cops. You'll be in handcuffs before the hour's up. Tom nodded, unfazed. Go ahead. She blinked, thrown off by his calm demeanor. You're not scared? He chuckled. Nope. You see, our sheriff ain't too fond of trespassers. I reckon I'll be just fine. Her triumphant smirk faltered, but she pressed the phone to her ear anyway, launching into a dramatic retelling of events. Yes, officer, I need immediate assistance. A crazed farmer has committed an act of vandalism against my vehicle. It's an emergency. My property is being held hostage. Tom glanced at Jake and Riley, who were both biting their lips to keep from laughing. The woman snapped, What do you mean it's private property? I don't care. I need someone out here now. She paused, her face twisting as the response clearly wasn't what she'd hoped. Well, you know what? I'll just sue the entire department and the mayor and... She went silent, her eyes narrowing. Excuse me? What does that have to do with... No, I don't have permission to be here, but that's not the point. Hello? Hello? She pulled the phone away from her ear and stared at it in horror. They hung up on me, she whispered, sounding genuinely baffled. Tom nodded. Yeah, Hank don't have much patience for nonsense calls. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Oh, we'll see about that, she muttered, turning sharply and folding her arms. Fine. I'll wait for the police to come to their senses and deal with you properly. Tom let out an amused sigh. You do that? It took about 15 minutes for Hank's truck to roll back into the driveway. He stepped out, taking his time as he adjusted his belt and pushed his sunglasses up his nose. He took one long look at the hay-covered car, then at the woman, then at Tom, who was leaning against the barn with a faint smirk. Thank God you're here, the woman cried, practically running to him and grabbing his sleeve. This monster has committed an atrocity against me. She pointed at Tom like he was a wanted outlaw. Hank gave Tom a slow, knowing look. So I hear, he said dryly. Yes, she wailed. He buried my car. I demand you arrest him immediately. Hank exhaled through his nose. You parked on his land. Her face twitched. That's not the point. Pretty sure it is the point, Hank replied, rubbing his temple. She stomped her foot, her sunglasses slipping further down her nose. I have rights. Hank crossed his arms. And Tom here has the right to not have strangers dump their vehicles in his hay shed. She looked ready to combust. So you're just going to let this hick get away with vehicular imprisonment? Hank tilted his head. Vehicular what now? He trapped my car, she shrieked, her hands flailing. This is illegal. I have connections. I will have your job. Hank pulled out a notepad, flipping it open with a sigh. Let's see. You parked on private property without permission, ignored the landowner's request to leave, then called me out here for a non-emergency, which, mind you, is actually illegal. Her mouth snapped shut. Hank nodded. That about sum it up? Tom fought the urge to grin. Sounds about right. You can't be serious, she gasped. He's the criminal here. Hank sighed, closing the notepad. Lady, best thing you can do right now is apologize, have Tom and his boys move the hay, and leave without causing more trouble. Apologize? She spat, the word dripping with venom. I would rather die. Tom shrugged. All right then. He turned back toward his house, making it clear he had no intention of touching the hay anytime soon. Wait, she sputtered. Where are you going? You can't just leave my car like this. Sure can. He tossed over his shoulder with a lazy wave. She let out a strangled screech. Hank shook his head. I got about a dozen real issues to deal with today. If you don't want to do things the easy way, you can take it up with the court. But I wouldn't count on them siding with a trespasser. She was vibrating with rage now, her perfectly styled hair frizzing from all her dramatic movements. For a brief second, Tom wondered if she might actually explode. But then her shoulders dropped, her nostrils flared, and she clenched her jaw so tight he could hear her teeth grinding. Fine, she spat. Get this garbage off my car. Tom smirked. Say please. She looked like she wanted to hurl something at his head. Instead, she closed her eyes, inhaled deeply through her nose, and after a long, painful moment, muttered, Please. Tom clapped his hands together. See? That wasn't so hard. With Jake and Riley's help, the hay was carefully removed, one bale at a time. It took about 20 minutes to uncover the car completely, and that's when the real fun began. The weight of the hay had done a number on the Mercedes. The windshield was cracked, spiderwebbing out from the center. The roof had caved in slightly, giving it a crumpled look. And the doors? Jammed shut, no matter how hard the woman tugged on them. She let out a shriek that probably registered on the Richter scale. Tom whistled low. Well, that's unfortunate. She spun toward him, eyes wild. You are dead. He just smiled. We'll see. She stood there, fists clenched, breathing like a bull about to charge. Her face was a dangerous shade of red, her hands trembling. For a moment, Tom wondered if she might actually take a swing at him. My car, she choked out. My beautiful, expensive, imported car. Tom tilted his head, pretending to examine the damage. Yeah, that's rough, he said, his voice devoid of sympathy. You did this, she screamed, her eye twitching. You did this to my car. I didn't do anything, Tom replied with a shrug. Just stacked some hay. Gravity did the rest. Her mouth opened and closed, searching for a retort, but nothing came out. Hank, still standing nearby, finally spoke up. Hate to break it to you, lady, but Tom's got a point. You're the one in trouble here. She whirled toward him. Me? Hank pulled a folded paper from his pocket and held it out to her. This is a fine. $10,000 for trespassing, illegal parking, and filing a false police report. The color drained from her face so fast Tom thought she might faint. Her lips moved soundlessly, then she let out a strangled noise. $10,000? Hank nodded. Yup. Might even be more if the mayor decides to add damages. That's insane, she wailed. That's criminal. You can't do this to me. Pretty sure I can, Hank said, tucking his notepad back into his pocket. And I just did. She was shaking now, gripping her phone like a lifeline. I'll fight this, she whispered, almost to herself. I'll fight this in court. Tom smirked. Well, that's one option. He rubbed his chin, as if considering something. Or you could make a deal. She snapped her head toward him. A deal? Yep, Tom said, nodding. See, instead of paying that fine, you could work it off. Her face contorted. Work? Here, 200 hours on the farm should just about cover it, he said with a grin. Feeding the cows, baling hay, fixing fences. You know, real work. Her face twisted in disgust. Absolutely not. Tom nodded. All right then. He turned back toward his house. Guess you better figure out how you're paying that 10 grand. She stood frozen, her body rigid. For a moment, Tom thought she might actually take the deal. She looked at Hank, then at the fine in her hands, then back at Tom. But her pride took over. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and glared at him like he was dirt under her heel. I'll pay the fine, she spat. Suit yourself, Tom said with a shrug. She turned away, furiously typing into her phone. Tom could hear the venom in her voice as she called someone. Probably her lawyer, maybe her husband, maybe whoever usually bailed her out of trouble. But he wasn't concerned. He'd won. Part 6, The Departure. The tow truck arrived an hour later, much to the woman's horror. The driver took one look at the damaged Mercedes, let out a long whistle, and shook his head. "Gonna cost a fortune to fix this," he muttered. She looked ready to explode again. She'd screamed, argued, even threatened, but the reality had finally sunk in. She'd lost. As the tow truck hauled her car away, she turned back to Tom one last time, her eyes blazing with hatred. "You are the worst human being I have ever met," she hissed. Tom smiled. "Ah, shucks. You flatter me." She let out a noise that might have been an attempt at a comeback, but she was already storming toward a waiting Uber. She climbed in, slammed the door so hard the driver jumped, and just like that, she was gone. The second the car pulled away, Jake let out a whoop. "That was the best thing I've ever seen." Riley wiped tears from his eyes. "Man, I thought she was going to explode at the end there." Tom shook his head, chuckling. "She might still." Hank sighed. "That woman's been a pain in my ass for years. Wouldn't be surprised if she leaves town after this." Turns out, he was right. A few days later, the mayor himself stopped by the farm just to shake Tom's hand. Apparently, the woman, whose name, Tom learned, was Vanessa Hargrove, had a long history of causing trouble in town, and this had been the final straw. Word spread fast, and by the time the fine was officially processed, Vanessa had packed up and left for good. But the real prize came a week later, when someone from the local feed store showed up with a gift. Tom unfolded the large poster and burst out laughing. It was a perfectly edited image of Vanessa's car buried under hay, with the words, "Parking, you're doing it wrong," scrawled across the top. He hung it up in the barn, and every time he looked at it, he smiled. Life on the farm returned to normal after that. The cows were fed, the hay was baled, and the tractor went back to its rightful place in the shed. But every now and then, Jake or Riley would bring up the haystack incident, as they dubbed it, and the three of them would laugh until their sides hurt. Tom didn't know where Vanessa Hargrove had gone, and he didn't much care. She'd taken her fine, her wrecked car, and her attitude somewhere else, and that was good enough for him. The farm was his again, peaceful, quiet, and free of trespassers. And if anyone ever asked him about the poster in the barn, he'd just grin and say, "Oh, that's just a little reminder of how to handle folks who don't know where they belong."